I think Miroslav and Tyler are working in, I would say, different spaces in the question of forgiveness, but also very complementary ones. So I wanted to start by asking both of them a little bit about their separate projects, and then seeing how those might interact. So Tyler, actually, I'd like to start with you. Can you walk me through a little bit your background in this work in the area of forgiveness? I know that you're working on a large study right now.
So at the Human Flourishing program, we're trying to bring together scholarship from the humanities, principally philosophy and theology, with empirical social sciences to develop better measures to carry out better empirical studies, to be able to evaluate hypotheses that may arise from philosophical or theological claims, and also to try to find ways to practically promote flourishing. And one of the topics which we've been looking at in this regard is forgiveness. We've published a number of empirical studies on the effects of disposition to forgive on subsequent mental and physical health. And the effects on mental health are especially strong on preventing subsequent depression, on relieving anxiety, on increasing hope. But right now, I think our most exciting project is to try to promote forgiveness in practice. We've been collaborating with a clinical psychologist, Everett Worthington, who spent 30 years developing forgiveness interventions to try to promote forgiveness for those who want to forgive and are having difficulty doing so. And we've tried to distill these decades of work in clinical psychology on this topic into a short 2 or 3 hour forgiveness workbook intervention, kind of helping people through steps of recalling the hurt, of trying to empathize with the offender, with offering a gift of forgiveness, with committing to that process of forgiveness, and with holding on to forgiveness as the emotions come and go. And so we're now testing this in a large randomized trial in 5 countries, in Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine, Hong Kong, and Indonesia, areas that have experienced considerable conflict. And we're looking at whether this forgiveness workbook intervention does indeed increase and promote forgiveness, but also whether it improves mental health and whether it affects other aspects of flourishing. And we're using this very rigorous empirical design, a randomized trial, the same sorts of designs that are being used to evaluate vaccines, for example, to try to definitively prove whether these forgiveness workbooks are effective. If they are, I think the implications could be profound, because these sorts of workbooks could be disseminated at national and international levels. I think a compelling case can be made that forgiveness itself is a public health issue, since being wronged is a very common experience. And the evidence suggests that forgiveness really does have profound effects on mental health. So we're hoping this randomized trial definitively establishes the efficacy of these forgiveness interventions and of this forgiveness workbook in particular, and that we can launch forgiveness campaigns at a global level. So we're still in the process of collecting data. It should be complete by September or October, and we'll proceed with publication from there.
Okay, so ready by this fall. What sort of, I mean, I'm speaking as a journalist here, and I know that one of the problems with covering scientific projects in any way is that we frequently just misinterpret them or pull results that are not necessarily the most material to the study. What kind of headline would you give this study? Like, what's sort of the top line finding that you are hoping to see? Or if you have seen any already, what do you have?
So we are not analyzing the data until it's in from all sites. We've pre-registered the study. The analysis will be blinded to who's in which group. So I don't know how things are going to play out. Well, I think the evidence is compelling that these forgiveness interventions are effective when carried out over multiple sessions with a counselor or clinical psychologist. Whether it can really be reduced to just a 3-hour do-it-yourself workbook, I think is uncertain. So it's possible that this will not be effective, even though the broader, more substantial forgiveness interventions are. But what we're hoping for is that it is effective, in which case, I think the headline would be something like easily accessible forgiveness workbooks promote forgiveness, improve mental health, and enhance human flourishing. That's what we like to establish. Whether that plays out or not, again, it remains to be seen. And that's why we're relying on these very rigorous randomized trials and designs and pre-registration, so that there really can be no pushback from the academic or medical or public health communities with regard to the results. So that's the headline we're hoping for. We'll see how things play out.
Great. And one last question before I turn to Miroslav, because I think this question will also apply to his work too. We're at this organization in this event. I think most of us are used to talking about the concept of Christian forgiveness in Christian or religious terms, but this is a secular project, am I right? And how has it been received?
Yeah, so the workbook we're testing has been designed so that it can be accessible to a very broad audience, including those with more secular inclinations. I mean, I think a compelling historical case can be made for the notion of forgiveness itself, essentially rising out of Christianity. So in that sense, I mean, Christian principles are still underlying the workbook itself. But you are right. The workbook is intended to be of use in sort of any setting with those of any religion or none at all. There have been, and we have been working in collaboration again with Everett Worthington on workbooks tailored for and interventions tailored for Christian groups specifically. And I think the existing evidence suggests that when you actually make use of and draw upon Christian beliefs, Christian commitment to forgiveness, the notion of one having been forgiven by God oneself, that the efficacy of these interventions is actually increased and enhanced. One study suggested an effect size of about twice as large for these interventions when grounded in Christian principles and teachings. And so, I think drawing upon Christian moral theology, Christian beliefs, Christian teachings on forgiveness is very powerful and really enhances these approaches. But what we're specifically testing in this randomized trial at present is a version that would be applicable, we hope, throughout the world.
Thank you. And Miroslav, I'll turn to you next quickly. I think you're working on the question of forgiveness in a slightly more theoretical or theological basis, but I know that writing about it at least hasn't been your main focus more recently. How are you thinking and talking about the concept today, if at all, as opposed to in the past? The political scene has changed. I think, welcome to discussions from a theological or Christian angle versus a secular angle has also changed, maybe due to the political situation. What are you seeing?
So what I've seen over the years, and I've worked on forgiveness probably at least 25 years actively writing. Basically, it was my interest in forgiveness was triggered by the experiences in former Yugoslavia and reconciliation processes, and then how forgiveness figures in reconciliation processes. Reconciliation and forgiveness are two slightly different but not unrelated things. And over the years, in variety of audiences in different parts of the world, I don't think that I have ever addressed a topic that garnered more interest than forgiveness. You have also anecdotal evidence from literature. I think Hemingway wrote a short story in which the father and son had kind of struggled and gotten into a little bit of a tangle, and then the father couldn't find the son, and so he announces in the newspaper, "Paco, meet me at this or that square, all is forgiven." And then the whole square was full of Pacos, so that the squadron of police needed to be brought in order to clear all the Pacos who needed forgiveness away. So it kind of illustrates how fundamental to our lives the sense, the need of forgiveness is. I think in the situation in which we find ourselves today, in particular, a number of things have shifted and changed. I'll mention two. One of them has to do with the way in which we have come to understand ourselves. We understand ourselves increasingly as kind of sum of our deeds and sufferings and the ways in which we relate to those. So our biography is what happened to us and how we related to that, and that's our identity. Now, forgiveness, in my reading of the term, means separating the doer from the deed, kind of ungluing the deed, meaning the wrongdoing, from the doer. But how do you do that if you define your whole identity by accruing events that happen and that you do in your own life? So it's all then at stake. So that's kind of one difficulty. The other difficulty, I think, is especially which is tied with kind of cultural struggles in which we're involved today, including Black Lives Matter and a kind of racial struggle. And that's the difficulty where kind of almost an expectation of forgiveness was placed upon a side who has suffered, so that then rhetorical forgiveness ends up looking like the perpetrator is trying to wrest forgiveness out of the person who has suffered, and that's obviously a very difficult and deeply problematic kind of situation. First, one is wresting the forgiveness, putting a blame on others for not forgiving. And second, I think, is that the rhetoric almost looks manipulative. We want to be left off the hook. And what is forgotten, this was my argument, and this will be my argument in that whole discussion, is that there are two sides of forgiveness, and maybe Tyler and I might disagree with how we understand forgiveness, and that would be a kind of productive way to engage in the discussion. For me, forgiveness is an interpersonal event. It's not a unilateral, I do something with regard to some, it's an interpersonal event. So forgiveness is like giving a gift to somebody. But if I give gift to somebody, that other person needs to receive that gift. Now I ask you, what is the way in which we receive forgiveness? What do we do to receive forgiveness? And what we do to receive forgiveness is we repent, we apologize, right? That's what our tradition tells us. Second, we restore. We kind of try to make good on what we have broken when we did the wrongdoing. And if we don't want to make the good, then kind of our wish to be forgiven seems to be a little bit phony and self-serving, right? So that in today's discussion, it seems to me that it will be as important, and even maybe more important, to talk about what it means to ask for forgiveness than what it means to give forgiveness, because the two are really two sides of the same coin. That's why when I talk about forgiveness today, I talk about apology often, about reception side of it, and I talk about reparations, and that opens possibly up the space for another side actually then to forgive. That's where I am right now.
Well, you posed a great follow-up question already, but I'm going to intercept it quickly and ask Tyler to respond to this a little bit in the context of his own work. In these workbooks, which you've mentioned, and this practice of forgiveness that they teach, what does that actually look like? Is it more about asking for forgiveness for the other person? Is it actually focused on giving forgiveness yourself to someone else? And is it interpersonal, as Miroslav suggested, or is it a kind of internal one-person thing? And when you talk about forgiveness as a public health crisis, are you necessarily referring to sort of the health of an individual? You know, my feeling of being unforgiven or not having forgiven, or the health of the public in a sort of common good way?
I know those are all good questions. I'm very glad that Miroslav
That
raised
was
this point
multiple
as
questions.
well. Kind of what is forgiveness? These forgiveness workbook interventions are developed for the victim, and trying to help those who want to forgive and are struggling to do so to forgive. Now, what is forgiveness? There's a large philosophical and theological literature on this topic. It's certainly disputed. The working definition we've been using, which I think does correspond to Miroslav's intuitions as to how we are understanding forgiveness, is the replacing of ill will towards the offender with goodwill. And that's it. While it is in some sense interpersonal, and so insofar as it always involves the perpetrator, and it's a gesture of goodwill towards the perpetrator, it is in another sense unilateral, insofar as in my understanding, the victim can forgive without any action from the perpetrator. It's simply replacing that ill will with goodwill. And I think that can be important insofar as, is it possible to forgive someone who's offended you and has subsequently passed away? If it requires an apology or some sort of restoration, then the answer would have to be no. And so I don't, again, I do think receiving forgiveness is important. I do think apology is important. I do think restitution is important. I do think seeking justice is important. And I think in some cases reconciliation is very important, but I would distinguish those from forgiveness. I think one can forgive, replace ill will towards the offender with goodwill, and that's different from reconciling. It's different from excusing or forgetting the action. It's different from not pursuing justice. One can forgive and still pursue a just outcome. So again, I acknowledge that the term is disputed, but that's the definition we've been using, and that's what kind of underlies the development of these workbooks.
I think it's very helpful for you to your distinctions to other domains or things with which forgiveness might overlap, but with which it is not identical. I think that I'm persuaded. What I haven't seen you distinguish is between how you define forgiveness and benevolence. That is to say, or even love of wrongdoer and enemy, right? And I think in theological traditions, we have always made a distinction so that forgiveness ends up being a specific case in point related to a particular wrongdoing or to set of wrongdoings. And it disrupts the relationship between the two. And forgiveness is about restoration of that kind of clarity about the relationship. And it can happen, of course, unilaterally, but it finds its fulfillment only when actually the other person reciprocates, and then two are kind of back to the position where they were before the injury has occurred.
So yeah, no, I think that's really an excellent point. And I think in my brief definition, replacing ill will towards the offender with goodwill, the notion of goodwill is doing a whole lot of work there. And I think from the Christian standpoint, we've tried to give a definition that might be appeal to those who don't share these Christian presuppositions. But I think from a Christian standpoint, that goodwill towards the offender necessarily entails at least kind of final eschatological reconciliation and union with God, a desire for that, a desire that the perpetrator achieves that. Now, what that means in this life may vary. In cases of persistent domestic abuse, it may be that reconciliation in this life is not appropriate, and that goodwill towards the perpetrator is actually ending the relationship and separating unless circumstances radically change. So I think there ought always to be a goodwill towards the offender and a desire for at least ultimate reconciliation. But again, I would distinguish those concepts. In my view, kind of following Aquinas or Eleanor Stumpf, I would understand forgiveness as a species of love. So it's a distinctive one in the context of an offense, but I would view forgiveness as a form of love.
So jumping back in to press on this point a little bit with you, Miroslav, you mentioned obviously some current events in which forgiveness could be taking place, but isn't, or maybe is in a slightly warped way. What do you think that forgiveness and restitution, the completion of this cycle, might actually look like in some of the situations that you referenced? For instance, in the case of, say, the Black Lives Matter movement in this moment in the United States. And do you actually see that taking place or happening?
I might not be the best person to kind of comment on the intricacies of the race relations in United States. I'm trying to catch up. I'm doing quite a bit of reading, and there's a lot of history to do. Right now, I'm reading this wonderful biography of Frederick Douglass. It's about 800 pages long, and it's really, really cool. But in many other situations, we have had reconciliation processes, and all the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, that they had each their own situation specific dynamics. They don't replicate the mother of all of them, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But my sense would be that whether it's a moment now or in the foreseeable future, we will need something like either Truth and Reconciliation Commission or processes of a reconciliation. I think they're better construed as processes rather than as this kind of events that occur. And something like forgiveness will probably be part of it. My own sense is also that it's easier to talk about forgiveness at an interpersonal level. It is more difficult to talk about either like reconciliation or forgiveness at a larger public level. And it's a very simple reason for that, is that at the public level, you have to act as a unit, as a whole, and their internal dynamics within the social groups is such that resentment can very easily occur, whereas one person might be ready to move forward, the other person is not, whereas one person wants to reconcile and forgive on these terms, the other person wants other terms, and then processes end up being stifled from within. But there have been successful apologies, there have been successful also restoration events. We have patterns for that. We need to start making concrete steps. And in the practice of making concrete steps to apologize for what has happened, establish the truth of the matter as much as that can be done, and move the process. And in the process, discover also what needs to happen so that given specificities of this history, we can have healed race relations or healed relations with a variety of other communities. And I would be very much pleading for that.
And you say health too, which again echoes what Tyler was saying about forgiveness being a public health problem. What do you mean by that, health on a societal level or a group level, as opposed to the interpersonal one-on-one level, individual level?
The body of society has also its own health and its own deep maladies, and those can be obviously physical nature, but they can be very much also of cultural, of spiritual, if you want, nature. And to me, the health means a kind of a harmony established under conditions of justice. If I think healthy organism, I think abilities to rejoice together over things, right? You think great public events that put smiles on our faces. They're events that in some way celebrate something that is ours and our common, right? And in the Hebrew Bible, joy in any case is not so much a private emotion as it is a public emotion. Paradigmatic example is Miriam with the tambourine after children of Israel have left Egypt. She sings the songs, lead them together. There is some incredible good that has occurred, right? And we celebrate that. Now, to me, that's a sign of a healthy organism as a society that can celebrate common history, common projects in the future. Such health indicators, if you want, can be named. Certainly, peace with justice would be one of them. Certain form of harmony, certain form of being at ease and at rest with one another. All of this, what in the Christian terms we think about kingdom of God, or what we think about home of God among mortals in the terminology which I would like to use these days.
Tyler, does that definition of health track with you? And can you see the extrapolation of your workbooks and this project to larger groups and larger events like this?
I mean, I would say very, very much so. I mean, everything Miroslav said strongly resonates with my understanding of health. I mean, I tend to think of health as wholeness, and as applied to the individual. I think we, in some sense, have two conceptions of health. There's a narrow conception, health of the body, wholeness of the body, that all its systems and parts are functioning well and coordinated. But then I think there's also a notion of health of the person, which I think is effectively synonymous with human well-being or human flourishing. So we might say, so-and-so is physically healthy, but they're not a healthy person. They're completely socially isolated and not engaging. So I do think we have these two different notions of health at the individual level. But I think that notion of the broader notion of health as wholeness of the person, as flourishing, is then likewise applicable at the community level as well, the flourishing or wholeness of the community. And I mean, we've been doing some very preliminary empirical work on trying to assess community well-being using more perhaps bland, banal items and constructs than what the beautiful description that Miroslav was giving, but I think very much corresponding to sort of kind of assessing whether the individuals are flourishing, whether the relationships are good, whether the structures and practices are sufficient to sustain the community. I think what Miroslav more rightly described as justice and peace, whether the leadership is proficient, is good, whether the sense of belonging, of community amongst the members, and whether there's a shared mission. So we've been doing some work in churches, in cities, and schools to try to also assess and study and understand community well-being or the health of communities. And I think forgiveness is critical to the health, not only of individuals, but to communities as well. I think these sorts of forgiveness workbooks can be used to promote forgiveness, and I think that itself will enhance the health of communities. But I think also really important, profound work of the nature that Miroslav was describing at the community level is essential. And these workbooks don't do that. These workbooks are about interpersonal forgiveness. But I think to address conflict and strife within a country or a neighborhood or community, such as the very difficult and important questions of racial justice that our country has been struggling with. I think while interpersonal forgiveness is essential, I think we need more than that. I think we need to seek just outcomes. I think we need the sort of truth and reconciliation work that Miroslav was describing. But I think both of those are rightly described as forgiveness. I think forgiveness is central to the health of communities.
I'm interested, Miroslav, we didn't get to this earlier, but can you say a little bit more about the conflict spaces that you sort of emerged from in your thinking, a little bit more about your background in this question.
Yeah, so I was born in former Yugoslavia and grew under kind of the communist rule. And this was already a conflictual situation. My father was a minister of a small church, and I was his son. And this is kind of, it was life full of tensions, even sometimes persecution. The war broke out in former Yugoslavia after I've already started studying theology and graduated with degrees. And then I asked myself a simple question. So what do I do in this situation as a Christian? How do I respond to it so that I don't betray my own Christian identity, while at the same time somehow contribute also to the life of my people? And out of this question, the book that I wrote later, Exclusion and Embrace, arose, which, you know, of all the books, I've written quite a few books, and people always tell you when you write a book, have an audience in mind. If you don't have an audience in mind, you won't be able to write a proper book. And I think that's correct, and probably everybody here as writers would agree. But this book, which is my most widely read book, I wrote only for myself, or primarily for myself. I wanted to answer a question that really was at the heart of my own existential kind of a struggle, and that very much concerned the kinds of issues that we were discussing, the questions of justice, of forgiveness. How do I reconcile Christ who dies on the cross for the sin of the world with kind of egregious, sinful wrongdoing that has been perpetrated against my people? That was my question, and that was my struggle. And obviously that question has a philosophical and theological side to it, and Tyler is doing great work in picking up where some of this conflict leave people and trying to figure out ways in which we can kind of in a responsible way promote forgiveness, which I appreciate very much the endeavor that's being there, because it gives it a more scientific and empirical basis, which some of us theologians, we know what the holy books say and what philosophers say, but sometimes it chafes against life, or sometimes it needs to be only shown that actually they don't chafe against life, that they are actually life-giving in that sense. And the work then that Tyler is doing is splendidly important.
It's, you know, it's funny that what you said about writing a book with a clear audience in mind. I'm, as I think Peter said, I'm writing my own book, and that is something that I am told frequently by my editor. But another thing that is kind of a truism in the book writing community is that often people write the books that they need to read. And so exactly as in your case, you tend to also be in some ways your own best audience, because you're looking for that answer. And I find that in journalism too, as an opinion columnist, I'm frequently writing columns that are just about the questions that I have and what I want to know more about. And I think that can actually be a really fruitful way to pursue really valuable questions, because you are a human person too, and probably your concerns reflect those of humanity in some way. But we do have some questions. So I'll go to Colin from Baylor University.
So my question is for Tyler mainly, but I suppose both of you could answer it. You've described how there's good empirical evidence that forgiveness is helpful and is healing from at least a psychological and empirical perspective. But it seems to me like to get from the fact that something is helpful in a kind of utilitarian way to the fact that it's good and just is like something else. And so I'm curious, in writing these workbooks and composing them for a broad audience that just like apply to people with different religions and philosophical backgrounds, how do you sort of make a claim that forgiveness is not only helpful and healthy, but good and healing from sort of a moral standpoint?
It's a very, very good question, very important question. And I think the answer is that empirical research can never establish that something is just, and cannot on its own establish something is good. We can evaluate the effects of a particular action on outcomes, but determining that those outcomes are good or that what has occurred is just is always a conceptual question. It always relies on a philosophical or a theological framework, and there's no way around that. We are hoping that these forgiveness workbooks are widely embraced, that even those from a more utilitarian perspective might see the positive effects on mental health outcomes and say, oh yes, maybe it would be good to use these. But I think the question of, is forgiveness always good? Is forgiveness always just? Can only be answered on either philosophical or theological grounds. My own view is that forgiveness is always appropriate. One can always replace goodwill with the offender. Ill will towards the offender with goodwill, and one can do so while still pursuing a just outcome. So provided one doesn't excuse the action or invalidate one's own experience, it's always appropriate to forgive. I also think from the Christian understanding, there's a moral obligation to forgive. I think the command to love one's enemies is a command always, in all circumstances, to forgive. That doesn't, again, necessarily mean reconciling in this life or a restored relationship in this life. But I do think there is, from Christ's command, a moral obligation to always forgive. But I would never claim to be able to establish that on empirical grounds. These workbooks were also, they're being presented as an invitation. If you want to forgive and are having trouble doing so, these are helpful resources, but we are trying to be respectful of the varieties of attitudes towards forgiveness that might lie outside the Christian tradition as well.
I think our next question is from Karis from Brown University.
Thank you. I think the word invitation kind of links to what I hope will come out as a coherent question, but I'm thinking particularly from like my American upbringing, some principles that I can now say almost reflexively are like separation of church and state, and of thinking about like having to kind of undo a lot of the subconscious thinking of religion as a private matter or of my faith as a private matter, and not realizing how much things are much more, I think things are much more complex than that. And I'm thinking of, as we talk about this quest and this mission, this obligation to not like convince people that virtues are good, but to illuminate the positives of living these virtuous lives, especially through forgiveness, and illuminating that to people and offering it as an invitation into this good life. I'm wondering to what extent we can ask for, to what scale we can promote this, or to what institutional level it is ethical to promote this in a way. Like, as we talk about forgiveness being an interpersonal matter, does that mean then that it's strongest and most productive to have these conversations about forgiveness in local ways? Or is it ethical, or is it right, or is there a way to ask for larger, I guess perhaps political and different skills within our respective industries, ways to think about enacting these virtues or encouraging these virtues? I hope that makes sense. I'm wondering if there's an appropriate level to which we should be talking about virtues.
Even when we think of forgiveness as an obligation, which Tyler said quite rightly, that it's a duty, it's a Christian duty. It's not a kind of optional extra. And some people might want to say it's really one of the kind of signature practices of the Christian faith. But even when that is the case, I think there is the pastoral element in the discernment what to do in every particular case and how to approach. How does the invitation look like, or how does the presentation of this obligation look like? And that's true even in the church settings, one-on-one settings. I think a more sensitive and to pluralism of values, sensibility, an approach has to be done in the context of more pluralistic societies. And I think the best, I very much agree with Taylor and what they're doing in terms of formulating this in terms of an invitation. And maybe simply best for me to say, I think the most powerful motivator for forgiveness often are the stories of the saints, stories of actual enacted forgiveness that has transformed relationship, transformed lives, because forgiveness is always a risk. You offer something to somebody and you don't know what's going to happen. Just like love is a risk, just like trust is a risk. And these kind of risky endeavors, we're invited to go into those risky endeavors, but in order to organize our whole life around these kinds of existential risks of the most beautiful kind, we need examples that illumine the practice with which we want to identify and who serve for us as legitimizers of that beautiful practice, and can point also others to it who might not share the worldview from which those folks come.
Yeah, I very much agree with everything that Miroslav has just said. I think from a Christian standpoint, there's a sense in which we can't go wrong by sensitively, at least rightly, promoting forgiveness, provided forgiveness is itself rightly understood, and we're not in any way impeding also the search for justice. So I think it's reasonable to always try to promote forgiveness, but I do think one, as Miroslav was saying, one wants to be respectful of those who understand forgiveness differently. I mean, it's a real open dispute, I would say, outside of Christian circles, whether sometimes forgiveness could be harmful, whether it might be morally wrong. Are there actions, what happened under the Nazis, is that really forgivable, or would it be wrong to forgive? And there's certainly Jewish scholars who would say, yes, you cannot rightly forgive that. And so again, I think while I would disagree from a Christian standpoint, one wants to be respectful of those with other views. So I do think formulating it as as an invitation is helpful. I think here also it can be helpful to draw on not theological but philosophical work, where cases have been made that provided proper conditions of the victim are met with regard to kind of not denying the past, not forgetting what had happened, not excusing the action. There have been philosophical arguments put forward that forgiveness is maybe not obligatory, but always appropriate. And I think drawing on those rather than on kind of the our rich and very important theological tradition can be very helpful in engaging those with other perspectives. They might still disagree, but at least one's putting forward arguments that are more generally accessible. So there's a essay by North published in I think late 80s, maybe 87, that puts forward what I think is a very compelling argument, but without explicitly appealing to the Christian tradition. But I think by formulating it as an invitation, it helps not fully, but at least partially address some of these concerns.
And I think very much as a practical matter, if we're thinking about institutions and different levels at which forgiveness could happen, either interpersonally, communally, or say society-wide, nationally, you simply can't compel forgiveness. You can't ask someone to forgive someone else by law. In our justice system, we attempt to have means of retribution and restitution, but it does not, in fact, peer into the heart, mind, and soul. So we do have to sort of explain it, invite people into it, suggest it gently in various manners, but institutionally, there's no way to force that to happen. And Tyler, you actually brought up a great question that I'm just going to throw out there because there isn't a hand raised right now, of misinterpretations or different interpretations of forgiveness. Can you give a further example of what you were talking about? And then Miroslav, also, if you have thoughts or examples on how forgiveness can be misinterpreted. You mentioned some a little bit earlier, but I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that several misinterpretations would be excusing, and forgiveness is not excusing. It's not saying that was all right. It's not that. I think another misinterpretation would be forgetting. Once you forgive, you don't have to think about what occurred and the past, the history is erased. I don't think that's forgiveness either. I think another misinterpretation would be kind of a restored relationship in this life, and I don't think that's necessarily forgiveness either. I think forgiveness helps bring that about in many circumstances, but I think the case of domestic abuse, repeated domestic abuse, can make that clear. I think it is sometimes confused with not demanding justice. And again, I think one can forgive, one can replace ill will towards the offender with goodwill while still pursuing a just outcome, still desiring the ultimate good of the offender, that there be change, that transformation, maybe even restored relationship, but acknowledging that they are a member of this community and have done wrong, and a just outcome needs to be sought. So I mean, I think each of those are potential misinterpretations of forgiveness. And when it's clarified, I think people have an easier time forgiving. I think a lot of the resistance to forgiveness is confusing it with some of these other ideas.
I saw a hand from Maria from JMU, if you want to jump in.
Yes, I'm really intrigued by this connection that you're drawing between forgiveness and like public health and public flourishing. And kind of one thing you mentioned is that this is like a universally appealing concept that is appealing in a secular society and a pluralist society. How might we as Christians think about kind of this goal of public flourishing, maybe even as an alternative to things like restoration of this world or reconciliation? Like, yes, that appeals to a variety of beliefs, but how can we as Christians think about how that might be like grounded theologically or scripturally? Like, we can clearly see calls for reconciliation and repentance and such in scripture. Do we see similar calls for like elevating this goal of public flourishing?
No, so you can see that in varieties of ways. I think if you don't lop off a New Testament from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament, and if you don't simply spiritualize the New Testament, you suddenly start seeing how the concern was of the prophets and throughout the Hebrew Bible, and also you can see it then of Jesus, was not simply for health of individual soul, but for integral kind of health of body and soul in the context of communities, and in our setting, in the context of the whole world. And probably best example to give is the book of Revelation at the very end. You see both the images of sin, of undesirable state, and the images of the desirable state as being social, even material. I mean, the whole book is that's really clear, a critique of imperial role and the image of what it means to, what it takes to be healthy and do well as a nation. It's a critique of Pax Romana and tearing down of this beast that the empire was. That's a collective project, right? That's public health issue. And similar thing you have then of verse, the New Jerusalem, which has always been interpreted throughout the history to have not just eschatological implication, but implications also for how we live in the here and now. So public vision is a Christian vision.
Also add that kind of on a practical level in terms of thinking about how to shift, what now is a very pluralistic secular society more towards that, beautiful vision of the what we should be hoping for is the kingdom of God that Miroslav was describing. I think pointing not just towards addressing wrongs and injustices, but also towards that vision, towards the positive. I think pursuing justice, addressing the wrongs is essential, but also pointing towards that we want more than just that. I mean, many people want a sense of belonging and of community, and simply addressing the wrongs, it's critical, it's essential, but it's not sufficient. I think for that we do need, ultimately love. We need goodwill for the other and desire to be with the other. And until that's there, I don't think we will have the sort of community well-being that we hope for. So I think one of the messages that Christians can communicate today is that while justice is critical and must always be pursued, we must supplement that with love. I mean, there's a great deal of talk today in academic communities and universities about inclusion and belonging. But if you look at what's done, a lot of it's trying to address microaggressions and implicit bias, and that can go some way in terms of clearing the path. But again, it's not sufficient for belonging. I think we need love for one another. And so, I think pointing towards that and forgiveness being an aspect of that, and I think is critical if we want to try to usher in the sort of vision that Miroslav just described.
I'll take a question from Avery from UPenn.
Yes, thank you two so much for coming. My question is sort of in a different direction. I was wondering, I guess, kind of about the modern or contemporary way of thinking about things, that I sort of seem to see a lot of people suggesting that one has to separate oneself from people who have harmed you. They're often called toxic people or something along those lines. And so I suppose what I'm wondering is this a valid conception of interpersonal relationships? I guess what I'm asking is this idea of separating oneself from another person as a result of what they've done antithetical to forgiveness, or is there some points at which this is necessary or just in some way? And if so, what might that distinction be? Or I'd like to hear more, I guess, about exploring that.
I suppose my response would be that separation sometimes needs to happen, but it's always kind of strategic. It's always in the function of a kind of at least attempting to kind of clear what has transpired. And I think from the Christian standpoint, not giving up on the other. It's a kind of sense that I don't have as a Christian an option simply to separate unless that separation is not in the function of the good that needs to come about. I think Tyler has mentioned earlier, and I will invoke a slightly different theological tradition than he mentions, but Martin Luther always thought that the function of forgiveness is to return the other person from the good from which they had fallen. And in that sense, you contact, obviously sometimes you need to break, but on the whole, it's in the function of return.
I think we'll take one last question from Serena from Yale.
So we've talked a lot during this session about how forgiveness is like the replacement of ill will with goodwill towards the offender. And I guess what I'm wondering is how that plays with like your feelings towards like the actual event that happened. Because like I can see situations in which you might not feel anything towards like that person anymore, like you wouldn't feel like ill towards them, but when you think about what happened, you still get really angry about it. And to me, that kind of suggests that like, at least for me, like I'm not over it. And so I haven't maybe really forgiven them. And like, I guess what I'm wondering is like, is there a situation in which you can be like very angry about what happened, but have forgiven the person because you have replaced the ill will with goodwill?
Give my thoughts on that. I think likewise that it's a very important question, and one which kind of gets to the heart also of personal experience of forgiveness. And I think in the psychological literature on this topic, what I find is a very helpful distinction is drawn between what's sometimes called decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. Decisional forgiveness is the commitment to forgive, to replace ill will with goodwill. Emotional forgiveness is the healing of those negative emotions, the release of those emotions, the kind of replacement of negative, unforgiving emotions with positive emotions towards the other. And that's only partially within one's control, not fully. But I think that distinction is very helpful for understanding the phenomena of, oh no, I've forgiven that person, I've made this commitment, and yet 2 days later, suddenly one's really angry or really hurt. And so, I think that emotional forgiveness involves, yes, forgiveness, but it also involves healing, and that process takes time, and again, is not within one's control. I think the command to forgive, relates to that decisional forgiveness, and hopefully that emotional forgiveness with time will follow. It's complicated, but I do think anger can sometimes rightly coexist with forgiveness, where one has replaced ill will with the offender towards goodwill, still recognizes the wrongness of the offense, wants some punishment for the offender, but only so as to accomplish the offender's good and to restore justice. I mean, I think having that righteous anger is a difficult state to achieve, but I think there can be instances where one is both forgiven and is righteously angry, wanting some punishment towards the offender, but only insofar as that accomplishes the offender's good and restores justice. But yeah, so I think that anger question is somewhat separate from what is common experience of feeling one has forgiven, thinking one has made this commitment, but then emotions being more complicated and they following with time.
Maybe it's just a footnote on this, maybe from slightly different perspective on the topic. I mean, it's possible, right, to have a goodwill towards someone, but to be angry with them for this particular thing that they have done, right? And I think the forgiveness in my evaluation is most appropriate in just such cases, because I can nurture general ill will. I can even commit myself that I would sacrifice myself for the other person, but my friend has betrayed me or done something in this particular instance. My general feeling toward the friend has not changed, but this we need to attend to this issue, and that's where forgiveness comes in, because generally relationships that we have to others are not, or wrongdoings are not all encompassing. They pertain to a particular domain, and in that domain, then forgiveness can be had. And distinction that Taylor made between kind of emotional and decisional is still right. And I think I've heard him also say, maybe in his some other lectures, that forgiveness is not just one-time event. It's a process and it's a practice rather than a simple decision that we make.